Let's get ready to rumble!
So, a few years back, somebody placed a newspaper on eBay called the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It was dated the 11th of December 1921. And there is a purported account of a secret fight in the paper between Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey, who was the heavyweight champion at the time. This article was sold on eBay and disappeared from the minds of interested observers, alongside the thousands of other items sold on a daily basis. Yet, for a student of boxing history, this newspaper may have been reported the most stupendous undiscovered event in the history of the sport. Now, since then, for 9 decades or so, occasional rumours about a secret match between Johnson and Dempsey have been heard to float about the boxing world. Maybe a hoax story, something they invented in the 20s just to entertain the masses. 25 years ago, apparently a man named John Peterson was said to have compiled a whole load of boxing material, including newspapers and magazines, some of which had been scanned. John knew his boxing, and he had met nearly all the great champions going back to the 40s. One of the scanned articles from the long-departed and short-lived American boxing magazine Fight Beat from 1985. Okay, I don't remember that one. It contains an article by the late Lou Eskin, a renowned boxing historian in the 1970s and 80s. Eskin was a former editor of Boxing Illustrated. He provides strong evidence that Johnson and Dempsey may have fought in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. And that's the same account that was found in the Daily Eagle. Eskin had purchased a newspaper in the 70s or early 80s. And apparently, there's a startling account of the fight in the Brooklyn Eagle. The fight was only for a private audience. It speaks of a very hard fight between the 43-year-old Johnson and the 27-year-old Dempsey, who was in his prime. They say Dempsey won by a KO in round 7 after recovering from a 5th round knockdown. The report of the fight for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle was written by one Ray Pearson. He says how Johnson was getting the upper hand in the early rounds, but was unable to stop Dempsey rushing in the 7th. Pearson writes, as early as the 2nd, Dempsey adherents were standing on their toes, white-faced and fearful, and they saw Johnson snapping jabs, left jabs to Dempsey's nose and mouth, blows which straightened Dempsey out of his crouch, then with the speed of machine gun fire ripping over right crosses which landed squarely on the jaw of the Manasseh Mauler. They saw something happen to Dempsey that never happened before. A punch that intoxicated Dempsey left him reeling and staggering and trying to protect himself from the Negro's punishing blows. Johnson's right crosses befuddled Dempsey and he couldn't fight in his usual style. He took more punishment in the 3rd and more in the 4th and was still on the receiving end of punches in the 5th session. One of Johnson's rights cracked Dempsey in the 5th and the Utah Mauler, is what they're calling him here, dropped to the canvas. He staggered to his feet at 5 and was still taking it, and the bell ended that tough session. Dempsey seemed a rejuvenated man coming up for the 6th round. No longer did Dempsey permit the black man to take the lead. When Johnson missed his normally unerring, accurate left jab, left, right, left went the Dempsey fist to Johnson's midsection. Those crushing blows by Dempsey, who now could not be denied, almost doubled up Johnson. The tide had turned, and Dempsey's followers were now sensing victory for their man. Then came the 7th round and the finish. Once more, the swaying, dashing Dempsey came catapulting out of his corner. He clashed with the Negro in the center of the ring when he landed the deadly wallops to the body of Johnson, which forced Johnson to clinch. The round was about 2.5 minutes old when Dempsey shot over a right hand which landed over the Negro's heart. That blow sickened Johnson, and he tried to protect himself. He dropped his guard, and over went the knockout punch, a terrific right hook on Johnson's jaw. Strangely, this fight has a sort of mirror image to the future Dempsey versus Sharkey fight of 1927, when Dempsey was staggered by Sharkey and took a battering. Then in round 7, a series of punishing body punches caused Sharkey to drop his guard before a thunderous left hook put the Boston Gob out for the count. Well, in all truth, Dempsey was throwing some low shots on Sharkey, and Sharkey stupidly didn't adhere to the protect yourself at all times mantra of boxing. He looked around for the referee and got hit by a left hook and put out. And Dempsey was taking a beating in that fight. But back to this article. But what are we to make of this newspaper account of the fight? Did it really happen? At this time in 1921, Johnson was 43 years of age. And not only was he an ex-champion, but he had been inactive for over 2.5 years. He also had just served a year in prison at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for violating the Mann Act, a dubious charge against Johnson concerning the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. This was brought by the American government at the time, which reflected deeply ingrained racism prevalent in white society. They hated Johnson's refusal to do as they dictated, especially concerning his penchant for white women. Johnson did, though, box exhibitions in prison. When released, he was out of condition and in desperate need of money. He challenged Dempsey publicly and other leading contenders. A fight with Dempsey would solve his problems. Dempsey at this time was in his prime, 27 years of age, and the heavyweight champion of the world. On July the 2nd, 1921, he knocked out George Carpentier. The fight was boxing's first $1 million gate. He did not box again until the 9th of March 1922 against Packy O'Gatty in New York in a 3-round exhibition. He continued with a series of uneventful exhibitions in America, and then on July the 18th, 1922, he fought Elzier Rock or Rio in Montreal. I'm going to assume with the French-Canadian thing it's Rue, not Rock or Rio, Rue probably. Quebec, Canada in the exhibition. There was at least 4 more exhibitions in Canada that year. Johnson also fought in Montreal that year, beginning with an exhibition against Battling Siki in September, and a further more 3 exhibitions. He also fought Homer Smith in a 10-round match in Montreal on the 22nd of February 1924. There is no apparent record of either fighter being engaged in any other boxing match at the time, or that they were anywhere else on September the 11th, 1921. They could have met, and both had links with fighting in Canada. In Dempsey's early autobio, Massacre in the Sun, he says, after the Carpentier fight and a trip to Paris, Dempsey's manager Jack Kearns put me to work right after we got back to pay for the trip. He found tame ones for me in Canada, Boston, Michigan. I knocked out 3 of them in 1 round in 1 night in Montreal. No mention of a Johnson fight, admittedly. Dempsey appears to be reluctant to say much concerning this period of time. We must remember that Dempsey's manager, Jack Kearns, was a conman of the first order and an invertebrate gambler. For a long time, what Kearns said, Dempsey did. If a secret fight for gamblers only between Johnson and Dempsey did take place, then Kearns was the man to swing it. Such a fight could generate huge revenue for all concerned. And Mike Tyson did say that to Harry Carpenter back in the day. He said that Jack Kearns created a lot of enemies for Jack Dempsey because Kearns was just, a rogue manager, a law unto himself. But why should it be secret at all if they did fight? There is a very good reason for this due to the aftermath of the Jeffries-Johnson match in 1910, which resulted in race riots throughout America, resulting in hundreds of deaths and serious injury. The American government wouldn't countenance a fight for the heavyweight title between a black fighter and a white one for the heavyweight championship, which could result in widespread violence. The last interracial heavyweight fight on American soil between Johnson and Jim Flynn in 1912 was stopped by the police after a farcical performance of headbutting by Flynn. Yeah, it's online if you want to see that. Pathetic. The great promoter Tex Rickard realized this and would never promote a mixed-race fight for the heavyweight title. A few months after the supposed Dempsey-Johnson fight, a fine black American heavyweight contender, Harry Wills, deservedly wanted to fight Dempsey for the title. Rickard killed the fight in the making. It was far too risky. Had Rickard been involved in the Johnson-Dempsey match, then he could have argued against Wills fighting Dempsey. Therefore, if it happened, Jack Cairns, not Tex Rickard, would have been a key organizer. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada would have been ideal. A long way from the threat of racial tension. Saskatoon was a booming frontier mining town and a gambler's paradise. A private gambler's fight without the knowledge of Rickard or the American authorities or even American society would make sense, because if it went public, it could have triggered violence. We must remember in the 1920s, the world was very different. Sport was not as regulated as it is today. Communication often took days. Secrecy was essential for such a match to take place successfully. Possibly Dempsey did not want to speak of it in his various autobiographies, due partly for tax purposes. Secret money avoids tax. Private fights for gamblers were allegedly common in the 1920s and 30s. Charles Bronson played a fighter who fought for gamblers in the film Hard Times. An American artist named George Bellows immortalized Dempsey in oil being put through the ropes by Louis Firpo. The Wild Bull of the Pampas is what he was nicknamed. Also painted the seedy world of private fights in the 20s, especially in his excellent Stag at Sharkey's. There may have been other evidence to give credence for this fight. The son of Jack Cairns apparently said the fight likely happened. Jack Hay, the alleged illegitimate son of Jack Dempsey, thought the fight could have happened and even wrote a play about it called Hoopla. The play was never published. Hay, who died in 2008, always argued he was Dempsey's son and devoted his life to becoming accepted by his alleged father, and was sadly unsuccessful. Hay apparently was asking for investments concerning his book A Pair of Jacks, because he wanted to make a Hollywood film about his life, and that was rejected. And above all, Lou Eskin himself wrote in the aforementioned long-departed Fight Beat magazine that he showed clippings to Dempsey at one of the New York boxing writers' dinners a few years prior to 1985. He asked, did the fight really take place or was it just a hoax? Dempsey laughed and replied, I always said I could beat Johnson. Eskin pressed further and Jack refused to comment. When he asked Dempsey if he could not run the story in Boxing Illustrated, Eskin was then its editor. Dempsey smiled and said, not now. Eskin understood this to mean that Dempsey didn't want it printed while he was alive. Eskin honoured his wishes and the story was put on hold. Dempsey did not deny any of this, in which means it's possible, but why the silence and continued secrecy? This remains unclear, but maybe it could be explained in the following way. Dempsey in later life reinvented himself, leaving behind the brutal fighting in mining towns, of riding the rods, of dodging accusations, of draft dodging, and especially the seedy connections of the world of prostitution and gambling. It was a life he wanted to move away from, to become a successful businessman and sporting icon. Such a story of such a fight with Johnson would not have been part of this agenda. Dempsey was gritty. It was a very grimy period in America. A postscript to this story concerns the fact that despite efforts to keep the alleged fight secretive, it did leak out. The Brooklyn Eagle claimed to have heard the story and wanted to print it and made efforts to verify it. A copy of a telegram was apparently sent to the sporting editor of the Saskatoon Star. This is apparently printed in the Brooklyn Eagle fight account together with the said sporting editor's reply, which said that as far as they knew, Johnson was not in town. Of course, secretive fights are illegal fights, and the local press would not be told. If the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper did make the story up, it would be a very strange thing to try and verify that for another newspaper. Now, in my opinion, did it happen? It could have happened. It could well have happened, But maybe the accounts could be a little distorted and dusty. As you see, they alluded to the Jack Dempsey fight, where there was a lot of similarities there. Almost like a lazy journalist might have just reenacted that fight and instead put Jack Johnson in the place of Jack Sharkey as the narrative. And, you know, the racial overtones of that time period and era, you have to look into a lot of that to get potential answers or hypothetical answers. Like, you know, they kept focusing on how Dempsey hit Johnson to the body, and that's how he got back into the fight, punched him to the heart, because there was a narrative back then that the black fighter, we're still in a period where the 3/5 human application to the Nubian man was still abundant. And in a newspaper prediction for Jack Johnson versus Tommy Burns, they said the reason Jack Johnson will lose is because the Negro, who has a smaller, undeveloped brain compared to the European, will be able to take the headshots because the brain will not be affected by the trauma of head punches because of the undeveloped Negro brain. But the Negro is cowardly of nature, so the body shots delivered by Tommy Burns will render Jack Johnson in a helpless state, and victory will be Tommy Burns. This was in a mainstream, what you would call tabloid paper of that time. It wasn't some unrecognized rag that wrote this. That's how they were theorizing things. So that could be put into question, how they wrote that. It seems something typical they may have wrote in that time to describe how a black fighter would be defeated, because he hasn't got no heart. Punch him to the heart, to the stomach. He hasn't got the stomach for the fight, etc., etc. But it's interesting all the same. It's interesting all the same. Drop your comments. Peace out.